Jeanne Zelen was a force of nature. She was a strong woman. Strong in body, strong in intellect, strong in will, and strong in heart. And her great heart was centered on her God and on her family. She was the eldest of John and Jeanne Foreman's 6 children, born on June 27, 1935. She was a faithful, loving wife to Don Zelen for 63 years. She was a mother of his 6 children, Deborah, Susan, Nancy, Don John, Nathan, and Ben. Her love for her husband, children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, for her parents and siblings and their children, and for her God was as deep and wide as her great heart. Jeanne Foreman was literally a coal miner's daughter. In 1935, John Foreman had just started working in the coal mines of Blair, Ohio, when he married Genevieve Dydek. Jeanne soon followed. Jeanne grew up in the middle of Blair's large German, Polish immigrant communities. Small hand-built houses on large lots surrounded by vegetable gardens, fruit trees, chicken coops, rabbit hutches, and some goats and cows. Jeanne said that she only had fond memories of her childhood. She loved her school and music lessons and all her close-by cousins and uncles and aunts and grandparents. By her own admission, Jeanne was a tomboy. She ran and climbed trees and loved her father. Boy, and that got passed down in that video, didn't it? Wow. She was the eldest of 5 siblings that were born during the 15 years in Ohio. Charlotte was born in 1937, Jack in 43, Eileen in 45, Chris in 49, and then me, Frank, in 1951, just after the move to Indiana. Actually, I was conceived in Ohio and delivered in 1950, Jeanne was a sophomore in high school. That's tough. The coal mines had closed and the family had to move where the jobs were in polluted urban Whiting, Indiana. It was a major adjustment for Jeanne. The 6 Foreman kids were crowded into a 2-bedroom house. But Jeanne's adventurous nature and energy was up to the challenge. During her first fall at George Rogers Clark High School, she started going to the football games. From the stand, she and her father were impressed by number 85, a classmate named Don Zelen. After the games, they met at the student hangout by the school, the Chatterbox. Didn't take long for the sparks to begin to fly, and Don and Jeanne became an item. A partnership that would continue for 65 years. She met his parents, Don and Rose Selesnik. Jeanne found Rose to be a loving, caring mother, but John was cold and interacted little with the children. He died in 1957. Presence in Jeanne's life. In June 1953, Don and Jeanne sat together for their school book picture as a graduating intended couple. That was done way back in 1953. Intended couples graduating. Don had ambitions and made application for colleges and football scholarships. Western Michigan University and Kalamazoo, Michigan. Thought they could use another lineman and said yes. Jeanne got a job as a secretary at Standard Oil, and Don headed up to play college football and to major in business administration. Absence makes the heart grow fonder and the love grow hotter, and the wedding date was moved up to March. And Debbie was born that year. Don's college in Kalamazoo and Jeanne's job in Whiting continued for 3 more years. Jeanne and Debbie lived in the crowded Foreman house for a time and then in apartments. Upon graduation in 1957, Don was hired as an industrial engineer at Youngstown Steel Mill. Soon after graduation from college, Jeanne brought her second daughter, Susan, into the world. After college followed 6 years in Whiting. 2 more children came into the Zelen family during that time. Nancy arrived 2 years after Susan, and Don John came just before they left Whiting in 1965. During the Whiting years, Jeanne loved the bonding between the Zelen and Foreman families. A warm, lifelong relationship between Don and John Foreman grew. And Don was getting his professional legs. He progressed rapidly through the management ladder. When a better paying job from Reynolds Aluminum became available, he took it. So in 1965, the family moved to the other side of Chicago, to Lisle, Illinois. Then Don's promotions started coming fast and often. Jeanne enjoyed her bigger house in Lisle for only a year before the company moved them to Florence, Alabama for 2 years. It was a culture shock and an adventure for Jeanne and the growing family. Jeanne and the kids loved their big house with a tree house in the backyard that you saw the monkeys climbing over. She especially loved membership at Bailey Springs with a pool that we could cool off in those hot summer nights. Don's next promotion took the family to Longview, Washington. Jeanne loved her big house on the well-shaded 23rd Avenue. And when John Foreman came out and saw the Great Northwest that summer of 1968, he was sold. Before the year was out, John and Jenny Foreman bought the house next to Don and Jeanne Zelen. And John worked at Don's Reynolds plant. The Zelens became magnets that pulled Jeanne's entire family west. Don could never induce his mom to leave her home in Indiana, but eventually all 5 of Jeanne's siblings made the migration out to the Great Northwest. However, within 2 years of managing that plant, new pressures came upon Don from higher management. They wanted the union squeezed out, and Don couldn't do it. He was asked to leave without severance or reference, right in the middle of a pretty deep recession. So after an unbroken line of advancement, the rug was suddenly pulled out. For a fearless woman like Jeanne, this was a challenging time. Debbie was in high school. Susan was entering her teens. Nancy was 11 and Don John was getting out of kindergarten. But Jeanne had confidence in Don and in God. Don left the industrial management and entered his entrepreneurial career. The next position was as a manager of a new store in Chehalis, Thermal Electric and Plumbing. So followed the season that Jeanne admitted was her favorite. They bought a big house on a small farm in Little Mantovine just outside Chehalis. Jeanne relived her childhood times of tending vegetable gardens and fruit trees and collecting chicken eggs and building rabbit hutches and tending goats and cows and even horses. And Nancy and Susan really liked that part. Part of the magic of that time, too, was that the Foreman family and all its branches were being swept up at the charismatic renewal. To a greater or lesser degree, every family member would be affected by this powerful move of the Spirit. Jeanne hopped on board early, eager and excited. The depth of Jeanne's faith in and understanding of God increased exponentially. Both Don and Jeanne would never be the same. To my mind, there is no doubt that Nathan and Ben owe their existence to this spiritual renewal. Before the Holy Spirit, 4 children seemed like plenty. But in the new life in the Spirit, new life in the family seemed like a good idea. So in 1974 and 1976, Jeanne welcomed 2 more sons into the family, Nathan and Ben.